It seemed like he had been riding long enough for the night to be over, but it wasn't, and the sand still stung his skin. He was surprised suddenly by a flicker of light to the west, so quick and so soon lost that he didn't at first recognize it as lightning. But it flickered again, and soon was almost constant, though still far away. At first, Newt welcomed it. It enabled him to see that he was still with the several hundred cattle, and also helped him avoid thickets. But as the lightning came closer, thunder came with it. The sound seemed to roll over them like giant boulders. Mouse flinched, and Newt began to flinch too. Then, instead of running across the horizon like snakes' tongues, the lightning began to drive into the earth, with streaks thick as poles and with terrible cracks. In one of the flashes, Newt saw Dish Boggett not 30 yards away. Dish saw him too and came toward him. In the next flash, Newt saw Dish pulling on a yellow slicker. "Where's Soupy?" Dish asked. Newt had no idea. "He must have got turned wrong," Dish said. "We've got most of the cattle. You should have brought a slicker. We're going to get some rain." As the flashes continued, Newt strained his eyes to keep Dish in sight, but soon lost him. To his amazement, he saw that the cattle seemed to have caught the lightning. Little blue balls of it rolled along their horns. While he was watching the strange sight, a horse bumped his. It was Dietz. "Ride off the cattle," he said. "Don't get close to them when they got the lightning on their horns. Get away from them." Newt needed no urging, for the sight was scary, and he remembered Dish describing how lightning had hit a cowboy he knew and turned him black. He wanted to ask Dietz some questions, but between one flash and another Dietz vanished. The wind had become fitful, gusting and then dying, and instead of beating steadily at his back, the sand was fitful too, swirling around him one moment and gone the next. In the flashes of lightning he could see that the sky was clearing high to the east, but a wall of clouds loomed to the west, the lightning darting underneath them. Almost before the last of the sand had stung his eyes, it seemed the rain began, pelting down in big scattered drops that felt good after all the grit. But the drops got thicker and less scattered, and soon the rain fell in sheets, blown this way and that at first by the fitful wind. Then the world simply turned to water. In a bright flash of lightning, Newt saw a wet, frightened coyote run across a few feet in front of Mouse. After that he saw nothing. The water beat down more heavily even than the wind and the sand. It pounded him and ran in streams off his hat brim. Once again he gave up and simply sat and let Mouse do what he wanted. As far as he knew, he was completely lost, for he had moved away from the cattle in order to escape the lightning, and had no sense that he was anywhere near the herd. The rain was so heavy that at moments he felt it might drown him right on his horse. It blew in his face and poured into his lip from his hat brim. He had always heard that cowboying involved considerable weather, but had never expected so many different kinds to happen in one night. An hour before, he had been so hot he thought he would never be cool again, but the drenching water had already made him cold. Mouse was just as dejected and confused as he was. The ground was covered with water. There was nothing to do but splash along. To make matters worse, they hit another thicket and had to back out, for the wet mesquite had become quite impenetrable. When they finally got around it, the rain had increased in force. Mouse stopped, and Newt let him. There was no use proceeding when they didn't know where they needed to proceed. The water pouring off his hat brim was an awkward thing. One stream in front, one stream behind. A stream of water poured right in front of his nose, while another sluiced down his back. Then Mouse began to move again, and Newt heard the splashing of a horse ahead. He didn't know if it carried a friendly rider, but Mouse seemed to think so, for he was trotting through the high hawk water, trying to locate the other horse. In one of the weakening flashes of lightning, Newt saw cattle trotting along, 50 yards to his right. Suddenly, with no warning, Mouse began to slide. His back feet almost went out from under him. They had struck a gully, and Newt felt water rising up his legs. Fortunately, it wasn't a deep gully. Mouse regained his balance and struggled through it, as scared as Newt. There was nothing to do but plod on. Newt remembered how happy he had been when dawn finally came after the night they had gone to Mexico. If he could just see such a dawn again, he would know how to appreciate it. He was so wet it didn't seem as if he could ever be dry, or that he could do such a simple thing as sit in the bright sun again feeling hot, or stretch out on the grass and sleep. As it was, he couldn't even yawn without water blowing in his mouth. Soon he got too tired to think, and could only hope that it would finally be morning. But the night went on and on. The lightning died and the hard rain stopped, but a drizzle continued. They hit intermittent patches of thick brush and had to back and turn and go on as best they could. When he had crossed the gully, one boot had filled with water. Newt wanted to stop and empty it, but what if he dropped it or couldn't find it in the dark? Or got it off and couldn't get it back on? A fine sight he would make if he ever saw camp again, riding in with one boot in his hand. Thinking about the ridicule that would involve, he decided just to let the boot squish. All the same, he felt proud of Mouse, for many horses would have fallen sliding into a gully. "Good horse," he said. "If we just keep going, maybe it'll get light." Mouse swung his head to get his wet forelock out of his eyes and kept on plodding through the mud. Chapter 32. Jake had forgotten to hobble the horses. He remembered it when the first lightning struck and Lorena's young mare suddenly snapped her rein and ran off. It was dark, and the sand was still blowing. He managed to get the hobbles on his own horse and the pack mule, but had to let the mare go. "She won't go far," he said, when he got back to Lori. She was huddled under a blanket, her back against a big mesquite tree, and her legs half buried in the sand. "No better than she likes to swim. I expect we'll find her on this side of the river," Jake said. Lorena didn't answer. The lightning filled her with such tension that she didn't think she could endure it. If it went on much longer, she felt it would twist her like a wire. She held the blanket around her as tightly as she could, and her teeth were clenched as they had been when she crossed the river. She kept trying to think about something besides the lightning, but she couldn't. She kept thinking of how it would feel if it hit her. It was said to be like a burn, but how could a burn travel through your body in an instant? Then the lightning began to strike in the trees nearby, with cracks so loud that it made her head ring. She didn't mind the wet. Jake had tried to rig a tarp, but it wasn't big enough. A bolt hit just behind them, with a sound so loud that it took her breath. "I want to go back," she thought. When she got her breath back, she was crying, the tears mingling with the rain on her face. "We got to get out from under this darn tree," Jake yelled. Lorena didn't move. He was crazy. The tree was all that was keeping them from death. Out in the open, the lightning would immediately strike them. But Jake began to pull at her. "Come on," he said. "We'll get under the bank. It might strike the tree." The lightning had become constant. She could see every whisker on Jake's face in the glare. He looked old. But he wouldn't leave her under the tree. In the flashes, she could see the river. The river had almost got her, and now he wanted her to go back to it. When he pulled, she fought. The tree was the only protection she had, and she didn't want to leave it. "Darn it, come on," Jake said. "This ain't no place to sit out a lightning storm." Every time he pulled, the tightness inside her broke out a little, and she struck at him. The first blow hit him in the eye, and he slipped and sat down in the mud. Then it was dark. When the lightning flashed again, she saw Jake trying to get up, a look of surprise on his face. But he grabbed her in the darkness and began to drag her away from the tree. She kicked at him, and they both went down, but a bolt struck so loud and so near that she forgot to fight. She let him pull her toward the river, dragging the tarp. Another bolt hit so near it shook the ground, almost causing Jake to fall in the water. There was not much overhang to the bank, and the tarp was so muddy he could barely drag it, but he pulled it over them and sat close to her, shivering. In the flashes, the light was so bright that she could see every wavelet on the river. She wondered where the turtle was, but before she could look, it was pitch dark again. In the next flash, she saw the horses jumping and trying to shake off their hobbles. She shut her eyes, and when the bolts hit, she felt the light on her eyelids. There was nothing to do but wait to die. Jake was shivering against her. She felt her muscles coiling up, getting tighter and tighter. "Well, I wish we'd brought our feather bed," Jake said, trying to make light of it. She opened her eyes to blackness, and a second later saw the lightning come to earth just across the river, cracking into the tree where they had made their first camp. The tree split at the top, then darkness fell, and when the next flash came, the split part had fallen to the ground. "We got old Dietz to thank that we're still alive," Jake said. "That one would have got us if we'd stayed put." You didn't thank him, Lorena thought. She put her head against her knees and waited. Chapter 33. By dawn, the rain had stopped completely, and the sky was cloudless. The first sunlight sparkled on the wet thickets and the hundreds of puddles scattered among them, on the wet hides of the cattle and the dripping horses. At the head of the main bunch of cattle, Call surveyed the situation without too much apprehension. Unless there was a lightning victim somewhere, they had come through the storm well. The cattle had walked themselves out and were docile for the time being. Dietz had been to look, and Soupy, Jasper, and Needle had the rest of the herd a mile or two east. The wagon was stuck in a gully, but when the hands gathered, they soon had enough ropes on it to pull it out. Ball refused to budge from the wagon seat while the pullout took place. Lippy had got out to help push, and consequently was covered in mud practically up to his lip. Newt had been extremely surprised when dawn came to discover that he was in his natural position in relation to the herd, behind it. He was too tired even to feel very relieved. All he wanted was to stretch out and sleep. Several times he dozed off, sitting straight up in the saddle. Mouse was just as tired and kept to a slow walk. Dietz reported that all the hands were well and accounted for, with one exception, Mr. Gus. He had been with the main herd for a while, but now he was nowhere to be seen. "He probably rode off to the cafe to get his breakfast," Dish Boggett said, "or else went into San Antone to get himself a shave." "He might have went to see Mr. Jake," Dietz said. "Want me to go look?" "Yes, have a look," Call said. "I want to cross the river as soon as possible, and it would be convenient to have Gus along." "It ain't much of a river," Dish said. "I could near jump across it if I had a long-legged horse." When asked how many cattle he thought might be lost, Dish estimated no more than 25 head, if that many. "Well, you nearly lost me," Jasper Fant said when they were all standing around the wagon. Ball had some dry wood that he had kept under a tarp, but the preparation of victuals was going too slowly to suit most of the hands. "I'm so tired I won't be worth nothing for a week," Jasper added. "When was you ever worth anything?" Dish inquired. He himself was in rather good fettle. It always improved his mood to have his skill recognized, as it clearly was, by all hands. He had managed to turn the main part of the herd out of the worst of the brush and keep it together. Even Captain Call had seemed impressed. The only cowboy who had not performed up to caliber in the emergency was Sean O'Brien, who had been walking out to catch his night horse when the storm hit. He was such a poor roper that Newt usually roped his horses for him if he happened to be around. This time, of course, he hadn't been. The Spettles, responsible for the remuda, were afraid Sean's awkward roping would cause the whole herd to bolt. Bill Spettle had roped a horse for him, but it wasn't one he could ride. Sean had promptly been bucked off, and when the remuda did bolt, Sean's horse ran with it. Sean had been forced to ride in the wagon all night, more worried for his life than his reputation. Bolivar had made it clear that he didn't like passengers. While breakfast was cooking, most of the cowboys pulled off their shirts and spread them on bushes to dry. A few took off their pants, too, but only the few who possessed long underwear. Dish Boggett was one of the few who had carefully wrapped his extra clothes in an oilcloth, so he soon had on dry pants and a shirt, which somewhat increased his sense of superiority to the rest of the crew. "You boys look like a darn bunch of wet chickens," he said. It was true that the crew presented an odd appearance, though Newt wouldn't have compared them to chickens. Most of them were burned a deep brown on the face, neck, and hands, but the rest of their bodies, which the sun never touched, were stark white. Bert Borum was the funniest looking, without a shirt, for he had a round, fat belly with curly black on it that ran right down into his pants. P.I. walked around in a pair of all-enveloping long johns, which he had worn continuously for the last several years. He had his knife and gun belt on over his underwear in case of sudden attack. "There ain't no point in getting too dry," he pointed out. "We got to cross the river after a while." "I'd just as soon go around it," Needle said. "I've crossed it many times, but I've been lucky." "I'll be glad to cross it. Maybe I'll get a wash," Lippy said. "I can't do much under all this mud." "Why, that ain't a river, it's just a creek," Dish said. "The last time I crossed it, I didn't even notice it." "I guess you'll notice it if 5 or 6 of them heifers get on top of you," Jasper said. "It's just the first of many," Bert said. "How many rivers is it between here and the Yellowstone?" The question set everyone to counting and arguing, for as soon as they decided they had an accurate count, someone would think of another stream, and there would be a discussion as to whether it should count as a river. The Rainey boys were sleeping under the wagon. Both had dropped like rocks once they dismounted, oblivious to wet clothes and too tired to be interested in food. The Raineys liked their sleep, whereas the Spettles could do without it. They seemed unaffected by the strenuous night. They sat apart, as silent as always. "I wish they'd talk so we'd know what they were thinking," Sean said. The silent Spettles made him nervous. Call was annoyed with Gus, who had still not returned. P had reported seeing him just after dawn, riding east in evident health. Call noticed the Texas bull standing about 50 yards away. He was watching the 2 pigs who were rooting around a chaparral bush. Probably they were trying to root out a ground squirrel, or perhaps a rattlesnake. The bull took a few steps toward them, but the pigs ignored him. Needle Nelson was scared of the bull. The minute he noticed him, he went to get his rifle out of his saddle scabbard. "If he comes at me, I aim to shoot him," Needle said. "He'll never live to cross the Yellowstone unless he leaves me be." Lippy, too, disliked the bull, and climbed up on the wagon when he saw how close the bull was. "He won't charge the camp," Call said, though in fact he was not so sure the bull wouldn't. "Why, he charged Needle," Jasper said. "Needle had to get going so fast he near forgot his dingus." At that there was a general laugh, though Needle Nelson didn't join in. He kept his rifle propped against a wagon wheel while he was eating. The bull continued to watch the pigs. Chapter 34. As soon as the sun got high enough to be warm, Lorena spread their gear on trees and bushes to dry. It seemed astonishing to her that she was alive and unhurt after such a night. Her spirits rose rapidly, and she was even reconciled to having to ride the pack mule. But Jake wouldn't hear of that. His own spirits were low. "I hate to squish every move I make," he said. "It ain't supposed to get this wet in these parts." Now that the scare was over, Lorena found that she didn't mind that things were damp. It beat being hot in her book. The only awkward part was that the few foodstuffs they had brought had been soaked. The flour was ruined, the salt a lump. At least the bacon and coffee weren't ruined, and they had a little of each before Jake rode off to look for her horse. Once he left, she went down to the river to wash the mud off her legs. Then, since the sun was already hot, she found a grassy place that wasn't too wet and lay down to have a nap. Looking up at the sky, her spirits rose even more. The sky was perfectly clear and blue, only whitened with sun over to the east. Being outside felt good. She had spent too much time in little hot rooms looking at ceilings. While she was resting, who should come riding up with her mare but Gus? "I hope there's still some coffee in the pot," he said when he dismounted. "I've usually had 10 biscuits by this time of day, not to mention some honey and a few eggs. Got any eggs, Laurie?" "No, but we got bacon," she said. "I'll fry you some." Augustus looked around with amusement at the muddy camp. "I don't see young Jake," he said. "Is he off preaching a sermon, or did he wash away?" "He went to look for the horse, only I guess he went in the wrong direction," Laurie said. Augustus took out his big clasp knife and cut the bacon for her. For a woman who had spent the night being drenched, she looked wonderfully fresh, young, and beautiful. Her hair was not yet dry. The wet ends were dark. Occasionally, a little line of water ran down her bare arm. Bending over the fire, her face was relaxed in a way he had never seen it. The strain that always showed in Lonesome Dove, the strain of always holding herself apart, had disappeared, making her look girlish. "Why, Laurie," he said, "I guess traveling agrees with you. You look pretty as the morning." Lorena smiled. It was funny. Out in the open, she felt more at ease with Gus than she had in the saloon. "How long has Jake been gone?" he asked. "Not long," she said. "He rode down the river looking for tracks." Augustus laughed. "Why, Jake couldn't track an elephant if he was more than 10 steps behind it," he said. "I guess we ought to call him back before he gets lost." He drew his pistol and fired a couple of shots into the air. A few minutes later, as he was finishing the bacon, Jake came galloping into camp, rifle in hand. Lorena was going around from bush to bush collecting the clothes, which the hot sun had already dried. "Gus, I didn't know we was going to have you for breakfast every day of the whole trip," Jake said. "You was never grateful for nothing, Jake," Augustus said. "Here I returned a $50 horse that you couldn't have found in a week, and all you can do is gripe about my company." "Well, there's such a thing as too much of your darn company," Jake said, looking to see if Laurie was out of hearing. "Are you jealous, or what?" Augustus asked. "Why wouldn't I be, when you've tried to poke every woman I ever looked at?" Jake said. "Whoa, now," Augustus said. "I'm just eating my bite of bacon. But I will say you should have brought a tent if you mean to take a sprightly girl like Laurie out in the weather." Jake didn't intend to spend any time bantering about women with Gus. It was good they had the horse back, of course. "I reckon we'll pack up and move on to San Antonio," he said, just as Lorena came back with an armful of dry clothes. "I don't want to go to San Antone," she said. "I've been there." Jake was taken aback. "Why, it's a good gambling town," he said. "We ain't rich yet. It wouldn't hurt us to stop for a week while the boys get the herd started good. Then we can catch up." "I don't like to go back to places," Lorena said. "It's bad luck." "Yes, and it would be worse luck to get up the trail and run out of money." "That's all right, Jake," Augustus said, flinging the dregs of his coffee into a chaparral bush. "I'll be glad to keep tabs on Laurie while you run into town and lose your wad." "What makes you think I'd lose it?" Jake said, his face darkening. "You'd lose it if I was around," Augustus said, "and if I wasn't handy, you'd probably get in a scrape and shoot another dentist. Besides, if anybody with a badge on is trying to hunt you up, I'd think the first place they'd look is San Antonio." "If anybody with a badge on comes looking for me, he's apt to find more of me than he wants," Jake said. "Let's get packed, Laurie. We might make town tomorrow if we push on." "I don't want to go to San Antonio," Lorena said again. She knew Jake hated to be contradicted, but she didn't much care. Before she could think, he whipped around and slapped her. Not hard, but it was a slap. "Darn it all, I guess you'll go where I say go," he said, his face red with anger. Lorena felt embarrassed to have been hit in front of Gus, but he seemed uninterested in what she and Jake did. Of course, he was just being polite. What else could he do? She remembered all the money Xavier had pressed on her. It was lucky she had it. She looked at Augustus again and saw that he was quietly watching, waiting to see how she would handle Jake, who was glaring at her, expecting her to cry, probably. But it had taken all the fury of the storm to make her cry. A little pop from him was just something to be ignored. She turned her back on him and walked off to start the packing. In a minute, Jake cooled down sufficiently to come over and squat by the fire. "I don't know what's wrong with Laurie," he said. "She's getting touchy." Augustus chuckled. "You're the one that's touchy," he said. "She didn't slap you." "Well, by God, why should she buck me?" Jake asked. "I'm the one that decides where we go and when we stop." "You may be and you may not be," Augustus said. "Maybe it ain't that simple." "It'll be that simple, or she'll have soon seen the last of me," Jake said. "I doubt she'll miss you, Jake," Augustus said. "You got your charms, but then I got my charms, too. I'll come and make camp with her if you decide you've had enough of her sass. I ain't violent like you, neither." "I didn't hurt her," Jake said. He felt a little guilty about the slap. It had upset him to ride in and see her sitting there with Gus, and then she bucked him. Gus always managed to aggravate whatever situation he was in with a woman. "I've got to go," Augustus said. "Captain Call will be mad as a hornet if I don't get back. Much obliged for the breakfast." "That's 2 you owe us," Jake said. "I hope you'll ride into town and buy us a feed when you're up that way." "Why, the 2 of you won't be in town," Augustus said. He trotted down to where Lorena was quietly packing the mule. "Don't forget to hobble that mare," he said. "I guess she ain't as tired of Lonesome Dove as we are. She was on her way home when I came across her." "I'll hobble her," Lorena said. She gave Gus a grin. Jake's little flare-up had not affected her good spirits. "If you get any prettier, you won't be safe around me," Augustus said. "I might be forced to cut the cards with you again." "No, I told you we're going to play a hand next time," Lorena said. "It'll give me a better chance." "You look out for yourself," Augustus said. "If that scamp runs off and leaves you, why, come and get me. You can find us by the dust." "He won't leave," Lorena said. "He'll be fine." She watched Gus swim the muddy river. He waved from the other bank and soon disappeared into the brush. She went on packing. Soon Jake couldn't stand it and walked over. "You oughtn't to provoke me like that," he said, looking a little hangdog. He tried putting his hands on her, but Lorena shrugged them off and went to the other side of the pack mule. "I wasn't provoking you," she said. "I just said I wasn't going back to San Antone." "Darn it, I'd like to gamble a little somewhere between here and Denver," Jake said. "Go gamble," she said. "I never said you couldn't. I'll stay in camp." "Oh, no doubt you've made arrangements with Gus," Jake said. "I guess he's planning to come over and teach you card tricks," he said bitterly, and turned on his heel. Lorena didn't mind. It was too pretty a day. The fact that Gus had found her horse was a good sign. She felt like riding, even though the country was brushy. She felt like a lope, in fact. Jake could sulk if he wanted to. She was looking forward to the trip. Chapter 35. The day soon grew hot, and the cattle, tired from their all-night walk, were sluggish and difficult to move. Call had to put half the crew on the drags to keep them going. Still, he was determined to get across the Nueces, for Dietz had said he expected it to storm again that night. There was no avoiding the brush entirely, but Dietz had found a route that took them slightly downriver, around the worst of the thickets. As they got close to the river, they began to encounter swarms of mosquitoes, which attacked horses and men alike, settling on them so thickly that they could be wiped off like stains. All the men covered their faces as best they could, and the few who had gloves put them on. The horses were soon flinching, stamping, and swishing their tails, their withers covered with mosquitoes. The cattle were restive, too, mosquitoes around their eyes and in their nostrils. Newt was soon so covered with blood from mashed mosquitoes that he looked as if he had been wounded in battle. Sean, who rode near him, was no better. Any inconvenience made Sean think of home, and the mosquitoes were a big inconvenience. "I'd like to be going to Ireland," he told Newt. "If I only knew where the boats were, I'd be going." His face was lumpy from mosquito bites. "I guess we'll drown the skeeters when we hit the river," Newt said. It was the only thing that promised relief. He had been dreading the river, but that was before the mosquitoes hit. To make matters worse, one particular red cow had begun to irritate him almost beyond endurance. She had developed a genius for wiggling into thickets and just stopping. Shouting made no impression on her at all. She would stand in the thicket looking at him, well aware that she was safe. Once Newt dismounted, planning to scare her on foot, but she lowered her head menacingly, and he abandoned that idea. Time and again she hid in a thicket, and time and again, after shouting himself hoarse, he would give up and force his horse into the thicket after her. The cow would bolt out, popping limbs with her horns, and run as if she meant to lead the herd. But when the next thicket appeared, she would wiggle right in. She was so much trouble that he was sorely tempted to leave her. It seemed to him the boys were driving the herd, and he was just driving the one red cow. Once the mosquitoes hit, the cow's dilatoriness became almost more than Newt could endure. The cow would stand in a thicket and look at him silently and stupidly, moving only when she had to, and stopping again as soon as she could find a convenient thicket. Newt fought down a terrible urge just to pull his gun and shoot her. That would show the hussy. Nothing less was going to make any impression on her. He had never felt so provoked by a single animal before. But he couldn't shoot her, and he couldn't leave her. The captain wouldn't approve of either action. He had already shouted himself hoarse. All he could do was pop her out of thicket after thicket. Call had taken the precaution of buying a lead steer from the Pumphreys, a big, docile longhorn they called Old Dog. The steer had never been to Montana, of course, but he had led several herds to Matagorda Bay. Call figured the old steer would at least last until they had the herd well trail-broken. "Old dogs like me," Augustus said, watching Dish Boggett edge the old steer to the front of the herd in preparation for the crossing. "How's that?" Call asked. "Lazy, you mean?" "Mature, I mean," Augustus said. "He don't get excited about little things." "You don't get excited about nothing," Call said. "Not unless it's biscuits or whores." "So what was Jake up to?" he asked. It rankled him that the man was being so little help. Jake had done many irritating things in his rangering days, but nothing as aggravating as bringing a whore along on a cattle drive. "Jake was up to being Jake," Augustus said. "It's a full-time job. He requires a woman to help him with it." Dish had gradually eased Old Dog to the front of the herd, working slowly and quietly. The old steer was twice as big as most of the scrawny yearlings that made up the herd. His horns were long, and they bent irregularly, as if they were jointed. Just before the men reached the river, they came out into a clearing a mile or more wide. It was a relief after the constant battle with the mesquite and chaparral. The grass was tall. Call loped through it with Dietz to look at the crossing. Dish trotted over to Augustus on the trim sorrel he called Mustache, a fine cow horse whose eyes were always watching to see that no rebellious cow tried to make a break for freedom. Dish uncoiled his rope and made a few practice throws at a low mesquite seedling. Then he even took a throw for a joke at a low-flying buzzard that had just risen off the carcass of an armadillo. "I guess you're practicing up so you can rope a woman if we make it to Ogallala," Augustus said. "You don't have to rope women in that town, I hear," Dish said. "They rope you." "It's a long way to Nebraska," Augustus said. "You'll be ready to be roped by then, Dish." "Where'd you go for half the morning?" Dish asked. He was hoping Gus would talk a little about Lorena, though part of him didn't want to hear it, since it would involve Jake Spoon. "Oh, Miss Lorena and I like to take our coffee together in the morning," Augustus said. "I hope the weather didn't treat her too bad," Dish said, feeling wistful suddenly. He could think of nothing pleasanter than taking coffee with Lorena in the morning. "No, she's fine," Augustus said. "The fresh air agrees with her, I guess." Dish said no more, and Augustus decided not to tease him. Occasionally, the very youngness of the young moved him to charity. They had no sense of the swiftness of life, nor of its limits. The years would pass like weeks, and loves would pass too, or else grow sour. Young Dish, skilled cowhand that he was, might not live to see the whores of Ogallala, and the tender feelings he harbored for Lorena might be the sweetest he would ever have. Looking at Dish, so tight with his need for Lorena, whom he would probably never have, Augustus remembered his own love for Clara Allen. It had pained him and pleased him at once. As a young woman, Clara had such grace that just looking at her could choke a man. Then she was always laughing, though her life had not been the easiest. Despite her cheerful eyes, Clara was prone to sudden angers and sadnesses so deep that nothing he could say or do would prompt her to answer him or even to look at him. When she left to marry her horse-trader, he felt that he had missed the great opportunity of his life. For all their fun together, he had not quite been able to touch her, either in her happiness or her sadness. It wasn't because of his wife, either. It was because Clara had chosen the angle of their relation. She loved him in certain ways, wanted him for certain purposes, and all his straining, his tricks, his looks, and his experience could not induce her to alter the angle. The day she told him she was going to marry the horse-trader from Kentucky, he had been too stunned to say much. She just told him plainly, with no fuss, Bob was the kind of man she needed, and that was that. He could remember the moment still. They had been standing in front of her little store in Austin, and she had taken his hand and held it for a time. "Well, Clara," he said, feeling very lame, I think you are a fool, but I wish you happiness. I guess I'll see you from time to time." "You won't if I can help it, Gus," she said. "You leave me be for the next 10 years or so, then come and visit." "Why 10 years?" he asked, puzzled. Clara grinned. Her humor never rested for long. "Why, I'll be a wife," she said. "I won't be wanting to be tempted by the likes of you. But once I've got the hang of married life, I'll want you to come." It made no sense at all to Augustus. "Why?" he asked. "Planning to run off after 10 years, or what?" "No," Clara said, "but I'd want my children to know you. I'd want them to have your friendship." It struck him that he was already years late. It had been some 16 years since Clara held his hand in front of the store. He had not watched the time closely, but it wouldn't matter. It might only mean that there would be more children for him to be friends with. "I may just balk in Ogallala," he said out loud. Dish was surprised. "Well, balk any time you want to, Gus," he said. Augustus was put out with himself for having spoken his thoughts. Still, the chance of settling near Clara and her family appealed to him more than the thought of following Call into another wilderness. Clara was an alert woman who, even as a girl, had read all the papers. He would have someone to talk to about the events of the times. Call had no interest in the events of the times, and a person like P.I. wouldn't even know what an event was. It would be nice to chat regularly with a woman who kept up, though of course it was possible that 16 years on the frontier had taken the edge off Clara's curiosity. "Can you read, Dish?" he asked. "Well, I know my letters," Dish said. "I can read some words. Of course, there's plenty I ain't had no practice with." A few hundred yards away, they could see Call and Dietz riding along the river bank, studying the situation. "I wished we was up to the Red River," Dish said. "I don't like this low country." "I wish we was to the Yellowstone myself," Augustus said. "Maybe Captain Call would be satisfied with that." When they reached the river, it seemed that it was going to be the smoothest crossing possible. Old Dog seemed to have an affinity for Dietz, and followed him right into the water without so much as stopping to sniff. Call and Dish, Augustus and P. and Needle Nelson spread out on the downriver side, but the cattle showed no signs of wanting to do anything but follow Old Dog. The water was a muddy brown, and the current fast, but the cattle only had to swim a few yards. One or two small bunches attempted to turn back, but with most of the crew surrounding them, they didn't make a serious challenge. Despite the smoothness, Newt felt a good deal afraid, and shut his eyes for a second when his horse went to swimming depth, and the water came over the saddle. But he got no wetter, and he opened his eyes to see that he was almost across the river. He struck the far bank almost at the same time as a skinny brown longhorn. Mouse and the steer struggled up the bank side by side. It was just as Newt turned to watch the last of the cattle cross that a scream cut the air, so terrible that it almost made him faint. Before he could even look toward the scream, P.I. went racing past him with the captain just behind him. They both had coiled ropes in their hands as they raced their horses back into the water. Newt wondered what they meant to do with the ropes. Then his eyes found Sean, who was screaming again and again in a way that made Newt want to cover his ears. He saw that Sean was barely clinging to his horse, and that a lot of brown things were wiggling around him and over him. At first, with the screaming going on, Newt couldn't figure out what the brown things were. They seemed like giant worms. His mind took a moment to work out what his eyes were seeing. The giant worms were snakes, water moccasins. Even as the realization struck him, Mr. Gus and Dietz went into the river behind P.I. and the captain. How they all got there so fast he couldn't say, for the screams had started just as Mouse and the steer reached the top of the bank, so close that Newt could see the droplets of water on the steer's horns. Then the screams stopped abruptly as Sean slipped under the water. His voice was replaced almost at once by the frenzied neighing of the horse, which began to thrash in the water and soon turned back toward the far bank. As he gained a footing and rose out of the water, he shook 3 snakes from his body, one slithering off his neck. P.I. and the captain were beating about themselves with their coiled ropes. Newt saw Sean come to the surface downstream, but he wasn't screaming any more. P leaned far off his horse and managed to catch Sean's arm, but then his horse got frightened of the snakes and P lost his hold. Dietz was close by. When Sean came up again, P got him by the collar and held on. Sean was silent, though Newt could see that his mouth was open. Dietz got P's horse by the bridle and kept it still. P managed to get his hands under Sean's arms and drag him across the saddle. The snakes had scattered, but several could be seen on the surface of the river. Dish Boggett had his rifle drawn, but was too shaken by the sight to shoot. Dietz waved him back. Suddenly there was a loud crack. Mr. Gus had shot a snake with his big Colt. Twice more he shot, and 2 more snakes disappeared. The captain rode close to P and helped him support Sean's body. In a minute, P's horse was across the deep water and found its footing. Call and Dietz held the horse still, while P took the dying boy in his arms. Then Dietz led the horse ashore. Augustus rode out of the water behind Call. The cattle were still crossing, but no cowboys were crossing with them. Bert, the Rainey boys, and Alan O'Brien were on the south bank, not eager to take the water. A mile back across the long clearing, the wagon and the horses had just come in sight. P handed the boy down to Dish and Dietz. Call quickly took his slicker off his saddle, and they laid the boy on it. His eyes were closed, his body jerking slightly. Augustus cut the boy's shirt off. There were 8 sets of fang marks, including one on his neck. "That don't count the legs," Augustus said. "There ain't no point in counting the legs." "What done it?" Dish asked. He had seen the snakes plainly, and had even wanted to shoot them, but he couldn't believe it or understand it. "It was just his bad luck to strike a nest of them, I guess," Augustus said. "I never seen a nest of snakes in this river before, and I've crossed it 100 times. I never seen that many snakes in any river." "The storm got 'em stirred up," Dietz said. Call knelt by the boy, helpless to do one thing for him. It was the worst luck to come all the way from Ireland and then ride into a swarm of water moccasins. He remembered years before, in a hot, droughty summer, stopping to water his horse in a drying lake far up the Brazos. He had ridden his horse in so he could drink, and had happened to look down and see that the muddy shallows of the lake were alive with cottonmouths. The puddles were like nests, filled with wiggling snakes as brown as chocolate. Fortunately, he had not ridden into such a puddle. The sight unnerved him so that he shot a snake on reflex, a useless act, to shoot one where there were hundreds. He had seen the occasional snake in rivers along the coast, but never more than 1 or 2 together. There had been at least 20, probably more, around the boy. On the south bank, the horse he had ridden was rolling over and over in the mud, ignored by the frightened cowboys. Maybe the horse was bitten, too. P, who had been the first to the rescue, swimming his mount right into the midst of the snakes, suddenly felt so weak he thought he would fall off his horse. He dismounted, clinging to the horn in case his legs gave out. Augustus noticed how white he was and went to him. "Are you snake-bit, P?" he asked, for in the confusion a man could get wounds he wasn't aware of. He had known more than one man to take bullets without noticing it. One ranger had been so frightened when his wound was pointed out to him that he died of fright, not the bullet. "I don't think I'm bit," P said. "I think I whooped them off." "Get your pants down," Call said. "One could have struck you down low." They could find no wound on P. Meanwhile, the cattle had begun to drift, with no one watching them cross. Some were making the bank 100 yards downstream. The cowboys on the south bank had still not crossed. "Gus, you and Dietz watch him," Call said, mounting. "We've got to keep the cattle from drifting." He noticed Newt sitting beside P's horse, his face white as powder. "Come help us," he said, as P and Dish loped off toward the cattle. Newt turned his horse and followed the captain, feeling that he was doing wrong. He should have said something to Sean, even if Sean couldn't hear him. He wanted to tell Sean to go on and find a boat somewhere and go back to Ireland quick, whatever the captain might think. Now he knew Sean was going to die, and that it was forever too late for him to find the boat. But he wanted to say it anyway. He had had a chance to say it, but had missed it. He trotted beside the captain, feeling that he might vomit, and also feeling disloyal to Sean. He wanted to go back to Ireland, he said suddenly, tears pouring out of his eyes. He was so grieved he didn't care. Well, I expect he did, the captain said quietly. Newt held his reins, still crying, and let Mouse do the work. He remembered Sean's screams and how much the snakes had looked like giant wiggly worms. When at last the cattle were started back toward the main herd, the captain put his horse back into the river, which startled Newt. He didn't see how anybody could just ride back into a river that could suddenly be filled with snakes. But this time, no snakes appeared. Newt saw that Mr. Gus and Dietz had not moved, and wondered if Sean was dead yet. He kept feeling he ought to leave the cattle and go talk to Sean, even if it was too late for Sean to answer, but he was afraid to. He didn't know what to do, and he sat on his horse and cried until he started vomiting. He had to lean over and vomit beneath his horse's neck. In his mind, he began to wish for some way to undo what had happened, to make the days run backward to the time when they were still in Lonesome Dove. He imagined Sean alive and well, and did what he had not done, told him to go off to Galveston and find a boat to take him home. But he kept looking back, and there was Dietz and Mr. Gus kneeling by Sean. He longed to see Sean sit up and be all right, but Sean didn't, and Newt could only sit hopelessly on his horse and hold the cattle. Augustus and Dietz could do little for Sean except sit with him while his life was ending. "I guess it would have been better if P had just let him drown," Augustus said. "He was an unlucky young sprout." "Mighty unlucky," Dietz said. He felt an unsteadiness in his limbs. Though he had seen much violent death, he had not seen one more terrible than the one that had just occurred. He felt that he would never again cross a river without remembering it. Before his brother crossed the river, Sean O'Brien died. Augustus covered the boy with his slicker just as the horse herd came clambering up the bank. The herd passed so close that when some of the horses stopped to shake themselves, the fine spray wet Dietz's back. The Spettle boys came out of the river wide-eyed with fright, clinging to their wet mounts. On the far bank, Call had the other men helping to ease the wagon down the steep crossing. "Now, if them snakes had come at Ball, he would have had a chance," Augustus said. "He had his 10-gauge. "The storm stirred them up," Dietz said again. He felt guilty, for he had chosen the crossing in preference to one up the river, and now a boy was dead. "Well, Dietz, life is short," Augustus said. "Shorter for some than for others. This is a bad way to start a trip." Bolivar was unhappy. He didn't think the wagon would make it, even across such a small river, but he was not willing to leave it either. He sat grimly on the wagon seat, Lippy beside him, while the cowboys got ropes on the wagon. "You mean Sean's dead?" Alan O'Brien asked the captain, so stunned he could barely speak. "Yes, he's dead," Call said. He had seen Gus cover the corpse. "It's me that done it," Alan said, tears on his round face. "I never should have brought the boy. I knew he was too young." Call said nothing more. The boy's age had had nothing to do with what had happened, of course. Even an experienced man riding into such a mess of snakes wouldn't have survived. He himself might not have, and he had never worried about snakes. It only went to show what he already knew, which was that there were more dangers in life than even the sharpest training could anticipate. Alan O'Brien should waste no time on guilt, for a boy could die in Ireland as readily as elsewhere, however safe it might appear. Jasper and Bert had seen the snakes, and Jasper was so terrified that he couldn't look at the water. Soupy Jones was almost as scared. The Rainey boys looked as if they might fall off their horses. More than anything, Jasper wanted to quit. He had crossed the Nueces many times, and yet, as the moment approached when he would have to do it again, he felt he couldn't. P and Dish and the others who had already crossed seemed to him like the luckiest men in the world. "Captain, do you reckon them snakes are gone?" he asked. "Well, they're scattered," Call said. As they got ready to go in, Jasper drew his pistol, but Call shook his head. "No shooting," he said. He had no confidence that any of the men could shoot from a swimming horse and hit anything, as Gus had. "Just quirt 'em if you see any," he added. "I hope none don't crawl in this wagon," Lippy said, his lip quivering with apprehension. The wagon floated better than expected. Bolivar barely got his feet wet. Jasper flinched once when he saw a stick he thought was a snake, but the moccasins had scattered and were not seen again. Alan O'Brien dismounted and stood and cried over his brother. Jasper Fant cried, too, mostly from relief that he was still alive. While they were having their cry, Dietz and P. got shovels from the wagon and dug a grave, back from the river 100 yards beside a live oak tree. Then they cut off part of one of the wagon sheets, wrapped the dead boy in it, and carried him in the wagon to the grave. They laid him in it, and Dietz and P. soon covered him, while most of the crew stood around, not knowing what to do or say. "If you'd like to sing or something, do it," Call said. Alan stood a moment, started singing an Irish song in a quavering voice, then broke down crying and couldn't finish it. "I don't have no piano, or I'd play one of the church hymns," Lippy said. "Well, I'll say a word," Augustus said. "This was a good, brave boy, for we all saw that he conquered his fear of riding. He had a fine tenor voice, and we'll all miss that. But he wasn't used to this part of the world. There's accidents in life, and he met with a bad one. We may all do the same if we ain't careful." He turned and mounted old Malaria. "Dust to dust," he said. "Let's the rest of us go on to Montana." He's right, Call thought. The best thing to do with a death was to move on from it. One by one the cowboys mounted and went off to the herd, many of them taking a quick last look at the muddy grave under the tree. Augustus waited for Alan O'Brien, who was the last to mount. He was so weak from shock, it seemed he might not be able to, but he finally got on his horse and rode off, looking back until the grave was hidden by the tall gray grass. "It seems too quick," he said. "It seems very quick just to ride off and leave the boy. He was the babe of our family," he added. "If we was in town, we'd have a fine funeral," Augustus said. "But as you can see, we ain't in town. There's nothing you can do but kick your horse." "I wish I could have finished the song," Alan said. Chapter 36. The whiskey boat stank, and the men on it stank, but Elmira was not sorry she had taken passage. She had a tiny little cubby-hole among the whiskey casks, with a few planks and some buffalo skins thrown over it to keep the rain out. But she spent most of her time sitting at the rear of the boat, watching the endless flow of brown water. Some days were so hot that the air above the water shimmered, and the shore became indistinct. Other days a chill rain blew, and she wrapped herself in one of the buffalo robes and kept fairly dry. The rain was welcome, for it discouraged the fleas. They made her sleep uneasy, but it was a small price to pay for escaping from Fort Smith. She had lived where there were fleas before, and worse things than fleas. As the boat inched its way up the Arkansas, the Brown River gradually narrowed, and as it narrowed, the boatmen and whiskey traders grew more restless. They drank so much whiskey themselves that Elmira felt they would be lucky to have any left to sell. Though she often felt them watching her as she sat at the end of the boat, they let her alone. Only Fowler, the chief trader, ever spoke more than a word or two to her. Fowler was a burly man with a dirty yellow beard and one eyelid that wouldn't behave. It twitched and jerked up and down erratically, so that looking at him was disconcerting. 1 minute he would be looking at you out of both eyes, and then the eyelid would droop, and he would only be looking with an eye and a half. Fowler drank continuously, all day and all night, so far as Elmira could tell. When she woke, from the fleas or the rocking of the boat, she would always hear his hoarse voice talking to anyone who would listen. He kept a heavy rifle in the crook of his arm, and his eyes were always scanning the banks. Mainly Fowler talked of Indians, for whom he had a pure hatred. He had been a buffalo hunter and had had many run-ins with them. When the buffalo ran out, he began to traffic in whiskey. So far, neither he nor any of his men had offered Elmira the slightest offense. It surprised her. They were a rough-looking bunch, and she had taken a big gamble in getting on the boat. No one in Fort Smith had seen her leave, as far as she knew, and the boatman could have killed her and thrown her to the turtles without anyone's being the wiser. The first few nights in her cubbyhole she had been wakeful and a little frightened, expecting one of the men to stumble in and fall on her. She waited, thinking it would happen. If it did, she would only have her old life back, which had been part of the point of leaving. She would stop being July Johnson's wife, at least. It would be rough for a while, but eventually she would find Dee and life would improve. But the men avoided her, day or night, all except Fowler, who wandered the boat constantly. Once, standing beside her, he knelt suddenly and cocked his rifle. But what he thought was an Indian turned out to be a bush. "The heat's got my eye jumping," he said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco into the water. Elmira also watched the distant banks, which were green with the grass of spring. As the river gradually narrowed, she saw many animals, deer, coyote, cattle, but no Indians. She remembered stories heard over the years about women being carried off by Indians. In Kansas, she had had such a woman pointed out to her, one who had been rescued and brought back to live with whites again. To her, the woman seemed no different from other women, though it was true that she seemed cowed. But then many women were cowed by events more ordinary. It was hard to see how the Indians could be much worse than the buffalo hunters, 2 of whom were on board. The sight of them brought back painful memories. They were big men with buffalo skin coats and long shaggy hair. They looked like the animals they hunted. At night in her cubbyhole she would sometimes hear them relieving themselves over the side of the boat. They would stand just beyond the whiskey casks and pour their water into the Arkansas. For some reason the sound reminded her of July, perhaps because she had never heard him make it. July was reticent about such things, and would walk far into the woods when he had to go, to spare her any embarrassment. She found his reticence and shyness strangely irritating. It sometimes made her want to tell him what she had really done before they married. But she held back that truth and every other truth she knew. She ceased talking to July Johnson at all. In the long days and nights with no one to talk to but Fowler, and him only occasionally, Elmira found herself thinking more and more about Dee. Joe she didn't think about, had never thought about much. He had never seemed hers exactly, though she had certainly borne him. But from the first she had looked at him with detachment and only mild interest, and the 12 years since his birth had been a waiting period, waiting for the time when she could send him away and belong only to herself again. It occurred to her that the one good thing about marrying July Johnson was that he would do to leave Joe with. With Dee, she could belong to herself, for if ever a man belonged to himself, it was Dee. You never knew where Dee would be from one day to the next. When he was there, he was always eager to share the fun, but then, before you could look around, he had vanished, off to another town or another girl. Soon the skies above the river got wider and wider as the river wound out of the trees and cut through the plains. The nights were cool, the mornings warming quickly, so that when Elmira woke, the river behind her would be covered with a frosting of mist, and the boat would be lost in the mist completely until the sun could break through. Several times ducks and geese, taking off in the mist, almost flew into her as she stood at the rear of the boat wrapped in the buffalo robe. When the mist was heavy, the splash of birds or the jumping of fish startled her. Once she was frightened by the heavy beat of wings as one of the huge gray cranes flew low over the boat. As the mist thinned, she would see the cranes standing solemnly in the shallows, ignoring the string of ducks that swam nearby. Pockets of mist would linger on the water for an hour or more after the sun had risen, and the sky turned a clear blue. At night many sounds came from the banks, the most frequent being the thin howling of coyotes. From time to time during the day they would see a coyote or a gray wolf on the bank, and the hunters would sharpen their aim by shooting at the animals. They seldom killed one, for the river was still too wide. Sometimes Elmira would see the bullets kick mud. When there was no rain, she liked the nights, and would often slip to the rear of the boat and listen to the gurgle and suck of the water. There were stars by the millions. One night the full moon seemed to rise out of the smoky river. The moon was so large that at first it seemed to touch both banks. Its light turned the evening mist to a color like pearl. But then the moon rose higher and grew yellow as a melon. It was the morning after the full moon that a fight broke out between one of the whiskey traders and a buffalo hunter. Elmira, waking, heard loud argument, which was nothing new. Almost every night there was loud argument, once the men got drunk. Once or twice they fought with fists bumping against the casks that formed the walls of her room, but those fights ran their course. She had seen many men fight and was not much disturbed. But the morning fight was different. She was awakened by a high scream. It ended in a kind of moan, and she heard a body fall to the deck of the boat. Then she heard heavy breathing, as the winner of the fight caught his breath. The man soon walked away, and a heavy silence fell, so heavy that Elmira wondered if everyone had left the boat. She began to feel frightened. Maybe Indians had got on the boat and killed all the whiskey traders. She huddled in her quilts, wondering what to do, but then she heard Fowler's gruff voice. It had just been a fight of some kind. When the sun came up, she went to her place at the rear of the boat. It was very still. The men were up, sitting in a group at the far end. When she looked, she saw a man lying face down near the place where the fight had taken place. He wasn't moving. She recognized him as one of the whiskey traders by his red hair. A few minutes later, Fowler and a couple of the men came and stood looking at the body. Then, as Elmira watched, they took off his belt and boots, rolled him over, and cleaned out his pockets. The front of his body was stiff with blood. When the men had everything valuable off his body, they simply picked the man up and threw him overboard. He floated in the water face down, and as the boat went on, Elmira looked and saw the body bump the boat. That's the end of you, she thought. She didn't know the man's name. She wished he would sink so she wouldn't have to see him. It was still misty, though, and soon the body was lost in the mist. A little later, Fowler brought her a plate of breakfast. "What was the fight about?" she asked. "About you," Fowler said, his eyelid drooping. That was a surprise. The men seemed to have almost no interest in her. Also, if the fight was over her, it was unusual that the victim had not tried to claim her. "About me how?" she asked. Fowler looked at her with his eye and a half. "Well, you're the only woman we got," he said. "There's some would take advantage of you. Only the one talking it the most is kilt now." "I guess he is," she said. "Which one killed him?" "Biggs Way," Fowler said. Biggs Way was the worst-looking of the buffalo hunters. He had an oily beard and fingernails as black as tar. It was peculiar to think that a buffalo hunter had been her protector after what she had been through with them. "Why'd he do it?" she asked. "What difference does it make to him what happens to me?" "He fancies you," Fowler said. "Wants to marry you, he says." "Marry me?" Elmira said. "He can't marry me." Fowler chuckled. "He don't know that," he said. "Biggs Way ain't quite normal." None of you are quite normal, Elmira thought. And I must not be either, or I wouldn't be here. "You took a chance getting on a boat with men like us," Fowler said. Elmira didn't respond. Often, from then on, she felt Biggs Way's eyes on her, though he never spoke to her or even came near her. None of the other men did either, probably afraid they would be killed and dumped overboard if they approached her. Sometimes Zwei would sit watching her for hours from far down the boat. It made her feel bitter. Already he thought she belonged to him, and the other men thought so too. It kept them away from her, but in their eyes she didn't belong to herself. She belonged to a buffalo hunter who had never even spoken to her. Their fright made her contemptuous of them, and whenever she caught one of them looking at her, she met the look with a cold stare. From then on she said nothing to anyone, and spent her days in silence, watching the brown river as it flowed behind. Chapter 37. Traveling was even worse than Rosco had supposed it would be, and he had supposed it would be pure hell. Before he had been gone from Fort Smith much more than 3 hours, he had the bad luck to run into a bunch of wild pigs. For some reason, Memphis, his mount, had an unreasoning fear of pigs, and this particular bunch of pigs had a strong dislike of white horses, or perhaps of deputy sheriffs. Before Rosco had much more than noticed the pigs, he was in a runaway. Fortunately, the pines were not too thick, or Rosco felt he would not have survived. The pigs were led by a big brown boar that was swifter than most pigs. The boar was nearly on them before Memphis got his speed up. Rosco yanked out his pistol and shot at the boar till the pistol was empty, but he missed every time. And when he tried to reload, racing through the trees with a lot of pigs after him, he just dropped his bullets. He had a rifle, but was afraid to get it out for fear he'd drop that too. Fortunately, the pigs weren't very determined. They soon stopped, but Memphis couldn't be slowed until he had run himself out. After that he was worthless for the rest of the day. In the afternoon, stopping to drink at a little creek, he bogged to his knees. Rosco had to get off and whip him on the butt 5 or 6 times with a lariat rope before he managed to lunge out of the mud, by which time Rosco himself was covered with it. He also lost one boot, sucked so far down in the mud he could barely reach it. He hadn't brought an extra pair of boots, mainly because he didn't own one, and was forced to waste most of the afternoon trying to clean the mud off the ones he had. He made his first camp barely 10 miles from town. What mostly worried him wasn't that he was too close to the town, but that he was too close to the pigs. For all he knew, the pigs were still tracking him. The thought that they might arrive just after he went to sleep kept him from getting to sleep until almost morning. Rosco was a town man, and had spent little time sleeping in the woods. He slept blissfully on the old settee in the jail, because there you didn't have to worry about snakes, wild pigs, Indians, bandits, bears, or other threats. Just the occasional rowdy prisoner who could be ignored. Once the night got late, the woods were as noisy as a saloon, only Rosco didn't know what most of the noises meant. To him they meant threats. He sat with his back to a tree all night, his pistol in his hand, and his rifle across his lap. Finally, about the time it grew light, he got too tired to care if bears or pigs ate him, and he stretched out for a little while. The next day he felt so tired he could barely stay in the saddle, and Memphis was almost as tired. The excitement of the first day had left them both worn out. Neither had much interest in their surroundings, and Rosco had no sense at all that he was getting any closer to catching up with July. Fortunately, there was a well-marked army trail between Fort Smith and Texas, and he and Memphis plodded along it all day, stopping frequently to rest. Then, as the sun was falling, he had what seemed like a stroke of luck. He heard someone yelling, and he rode into a little clearing near the trail, only to discover that the reason there was a clearing was that a farmer had cut down the trees. Now the man was trying to get the clearing even clearer by pulling up the stumps, using a team of mules for the purpose. The mules were tugging and pulling at a big stump, with the farmer yelling at them to pull harder. Rosco had little interest in the work, but he did have an interest in the presence of the farmer, which must mean that a cabin was somewhere near. Maybe he could sleep with a roof over his head for one more night. He rode over and stopped a respectful distance away so as not to frighten the mule team. The stump was only partly out. Quite a few of its thick roots were still running into the ground. At that point the farmer, who was wearing a floppy hat, happened to notice Rosco. Immediately the action stopped as the farmer looked him over. Rosco rode a little closer, meaning to introduce himself, when to his great surprise the farmer took off his hat and turned out not to be a he. Instead, the farmer was a good-sized woman wearing man's clothes. She had brown hair and had sweated through her shirt. "Well, are you going to get off and help, or are you just going to sit there looking dumb?" she asked, wiping her forehead. "I'm a deputy sheriff," Rosco replied. thinking that would be all the explanation that was needed. "Then take off your star if it's that heavy," the woman said. "Help me cut these roots. I'd like to get this stump out before dark. Otherwise we'll have to work at night, and I hate to waste the coal oil." Rosco hardly knew what to think. He had never tried to pull up a stump in his life, and didn't want to start. On the other hand, he didn't want to sleep in the woods another night if he could help it. The woman was looking Memphis over while she caught her breath. "We might could hitch that horse to the team," she said. "My mules ain't particular." "Why, this horse wouldn't know what to do if it was hitched," Rosco said. "It's a riding horse." "Oh, I see," the woman said. "You mean it's dumb or too lazy to work." It seemed the world was full of outspoken women. The woman farmer reminded Rosco a little of Peach. Somewhat reluctantly, he got down and tied Memphis to a bush at the edge of the field. The woman was waiting impatiently. She handed Rosco an axe, and he began to cut the thick, tough roots, while the woman encouraged the team. The stump edged out of the ground a little farther, but it didn't come loose. Rosco hadn't handled an axe much in the last few years, and was awkward with it. Cutting roots was not like cutting firewood. The roots were so tough the axe tended to bounce unless the hit was perfect. Once he hit a root too close to the stump, and the axe bounced out of his hand and nearly hit the woman on the foot. "Darn, I never meant to let it get loose from me," Rosco said. The woman looked disgusted. "If I had a piece of rawhide, I'd tie it to your hand," she said. "Then the two of you could flop around all you wanted to. What town hired you to be deputy sheriff, anyway?" "Why, Fort Smith," Rosco said. "July Johnson's the sheriff." "I wish he'd been the one that showed up," the woman said. "Maybe he'd know how to chop a root." Then she began to pop the mules again, and Rosco continued to whack at the roots, squeezing the axe tightly so it wouldn't slip loose again. In no time he was sweating worse than the woman, sweat dripping into his eyes and off his nose. It had been years since he had sweated much, and he didn't enjoy the sensation. While he was half blinded by the sweat, the mules gave a big pull, and one of the roots that he'd been about to cut suddenly slipped out of the ground, uncurled, and lashed at him like a snake. The root hit him just above the knees and knocked him backward, causing him to drop the axe again. He tried to regain his balance, but lost it and fell flat on his back. The root was still twitching and curling as if it had a life of its own. The woman didn't even look around. The mules had the stump moving, and she kept at them, popping them with the reins and yelling at them as if they were deaf, while Rosco lay there and watched the big stump slowly come out of the hole where it had been for so many years. A couple of small roots still held, but the mules kept going, and the stump was soon free. Rosco got slowly to his feet, only to realize that he could barely walk. The woman seemed to derive a certain amusement from the way he hobbled around, trying to gain control of his limbs. "Who did they send you off to catch?" she asked. "Or did they just decide you wasn't worth your salary and run you out of town?" Rosco felt aggrieved. Even strangers didn't seem to think he was worth his salary, and yet in his view he did a fine job of keeping the jail. "I'm after July Johnson," he said. "His wife run off." "I wish she'd run this way," the woman said. "I'd put her to work helping me clear this field. It's slow work doing it alone." And yet the woman had made progress. At the south edge of the field where Memphis was tied, 40 or 50 stumps were lined up. "Where's your men folks?" Rosco asked. "Dead or gone," the woman said. "I can't find no husband that knows how to stay alive. My boys didn't care for the work, so they left about the time of the war and didn't come back. What's your name, deputy?" "Rosco Brown," Rosco said. "I'm Louisa," the woman said. "Louisa Brooks. I was born in Alabama, and I wish I'd stayed. Got 2 husbands buried there, and there's another buried on this property here, right back of the house. He's buried. That was Jim," she added. "He was fat, and I couldn't get him in the wagon, so I dug the hole, and there he lies." "Well, that's a shame," Rosco said. "No, we didn't get on," Louisa said. "He drank whiskey and talked the Bible, too, and I like a man that does one thing or the other. I told him once he could fall dead for all I care, and it wasn't 3 weeks before the fool just did it." Though Rosco had been hopeful of staying the night, He was beginning to lose his inclination. Louisa Brooks was almost as scary as wild pigs in his view. The mules dragged the stump over to where the others were, and Rosco walked over and helped Louisa untie it. "Rosco, you're invited to supper," she said, before he could make up his mind to go. "I bet you can eat better than you chop." "Oh, I ought to get on after July," Rosco said half-heartedly. "His wife run off." "I meant to run off before Jim went and died," Louisa said. "If I had, I wouldn't have had to bury him. Jim was fat. I had to hitch a mule to him to drag him out of the house. Spent all day pulling up stumps and then had to work half the night planting a husband. How old are you getting to be?" "Why, 48, I guess," Rosco said, surprised to be asked. Louisa took off her hat and fanned herself with it as they followed the mules down one edge of the field. Rosco led his horse. "The skinny ones last longer than the fat ones," Louisa said. "You'll probably last till you're about 60. Or longer, I hope," Rosco said. "Can you cook?" Louisa asked. She was a fair-looking woman, though large. "No," Rosco admitted. "I generally eat at the saloon, or else go home with July." "I can't neither," Louisa said. "Never interested me. What I like is farming. I'd farm day and night if it didn't take so much coal oil." That seemed curious. Rosco had never heard of a woman farmer, though plenty of black women picked cotton during the season. They came to a good-sized clearing without a stump in it. There was a large cabin and a rail corral. Louisa unharnessed the mules and put them in the pen. "I'd leave 'em out, but they'd run off," she said. "They don't like farming as much as I do. I guess we'll have cornbread for supper. It's about all I eat." "Why not bacon?" Rosco asked. He was quite hungry, and would have appreciated a good hunk of bacon or a chop of some kind. Several chickens were scratching around the cabin. Any one of them would have made good eating, but he didn't feel he ought to mention it since he was the guest. "I won't have no pigs around," Louisa said. "Too smart. I won't bother with animals I have to outwit. I'd rather just farm." True to her word, Louisa served up a meal of cornbread, washed down with well water. The cabin was roomy and clean, but there was not much food in it. Rosco was puzzled as to how Louisa could keep going with nothing but cornbread in her. It occurred to him that he had not seen a milk cow anywhere, so evidently she had even dispensed with such amenities as milk and butter. She herself munched a plate of cornbread contentedly, now and then fanning herself. It was hot and still in the cabin. "I doubt you'll catch that sheriff," she said, looking Rosco over. Rosco doubted it too, but felt that he had to make a show of trying at least. What was more likely was that if he rode around long enough, July would eventually come and find him. "Well, he went to Texas," he said. "Maybe I'll strike someone that's seen him." "Yes, and maybe you'll ride right into a big mess of Comanche Indians," Louisa said. "You do that and you'll never enjoy another good plate of cornbread." Rosco let the remark pass. The less said about Indians, the better, in his view. He munched cornbread for a while, preferring not to think about any of the various things that might happen to him in Texas. "Was you ever married?" Louisa asked. "No, ma'am," Rosco said. "I was never even engaged." "In other words, you've went to waste," Louisa said. "Well, I've been a deputy sheriff for a good spell," Rosco said. "I keep the jail." Louisa was watching him closely in a way that made him a little uncomfortable. The only light in the cabin came from a small coal-oil lamp on the table. A few small bugs buzzed around the lamp, their movements casting shadows on the table. The cornbread was so dry that Rosco kept having to dip dipperfuls of water to wash it down. "Rosco, you're in the wrong trade," Louisa said. "If you could just learn to handle an axe, you might make a good farmer." Rosco didn't know what to say to that. Nothing was less likely than that he would make a farmer. "Why'd that sheriff's wife run off?" Louisa asked. "She didn't say," Rosco said. "Maybe she said to July, but I doubt it, since he left before she did." "Didn't like Arkansas, I guess," Louisa said. "He might just as well let her go if that's the case. I like it myself, though it ain't no Alabama." After that the conversation lagged. Rosco kept wishing there was something to eat besides cornbread, but there wasn't. Louisa continued to watch him from the other side of the table. "Rosco, have you had any experience with women at all?" she asked after a bit. To Rosco it seemed a bold question, and he took his time answering it. Once, about 20 years earlier, he had fancied a girl named Betsy, and had been thinking about asking her to take a walk with him some night. But he was shy, and while he was getting around to asking, Betsy died of smallpox. He had always regretted that they never got to take their walk, but after that he hadn't tried to have much to do with women. "Well, not much," he admitted finally. "I got the solution to both our problems," Louisa said. "You let that sheriff find his own wife, and stay here and we'll get married." She said it in the same confident, slightly loud voice that she always seemed to use. After a day of yelling at mules, it was probably hard to speak in a quiet voice. Despite the loudness, Rosco assumed he had misunderstood her. A woman didn't just out and ask a man to marry. He pondered what she had said a minute, trying to figure out where he might have missed her meaning. It stumped him, though, so he chewed slowly on his last bite of cornbread. "What was it you said?" he asked finally. "I said we ought to get married," Louisa said loudly. "What I like about you is you're quiet. Jim talked every second that he didn't have a whiskey bottle in his mouth. I got tired of listening. Also, you're skinny. If you don't last, you'll be easy to bury. I've buried enough husbands to take such things into account. What do you say?" "I don't want to," Rosco said. He was aware that it sounded impolite, but was too startled to say otherwise. "Well, you ain't had time to think about it," Louisa said. "Give it some thought while you're finishing the cornbread. Much as I hate burying husbands, I don't want to live alone. Jim wasn't much good, but he was somebody in the bed at least. I've had 6 boys in all, but not a one of 'em stayed around. Had 2 girls, but they both died. That's 8 children. I always meant to have 10, but I've got 2 to go, and time's running out." She munched her cornbread for a while. She seemed to be amused, though Rosco couldn't figure out what might be amusing. "How big was your family?" she asked. "There's just 4 of us boys," Rosco said. "Ma died young." Louisa was watching him, which made him nervous. He remembered that he was supposed to be thinking about the prospect of marrying her while he finished the cornbread, but in fact his appetite was about gone anyway, and he was having to choke it down. He began to feel more and more of a grievance against more and more people. The start of it all was Jake Spoon, who had no business coming to Fort Smith in the first place. It seemed to him that a chain of thoughtless actions on the part of many people he knew had resulted in his being stuck in a cabin in the wilderness with a difficult widow woman. Jake should have kept his pistol handier and not resorted to a buffalo gun. Benny Johnson should have been paying attention to his dentistry and not walking around in the street in the middle of the day. July shouldn't have married Elmira if she was going to run off, and of course Elmira certainly had no business getting on the whiskey boat. In all of it, no one had given much consideration to him, least of all the townspeople of Fort Smith. Peach Johnson and Charlie Barnes in particular had done their best to see that he had to leave. But if the townspeople of Fort Smith had not considered him, the same couldn't be said for Louisa Brooks, who was giving him a good deal more consideration than he was accustomed to.